This session is, I'm going to cover the NEC formal contract, which is a suite of contracts that at its heart is based on implementing sound project management principles in terms of controlling the procurement of work, services, or the supply of goods. As a contract, it obviously defines legal relationships. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about just an overview of the contract, some of the principles behind the contract, and some examples of where it has been used. So the contract, there is a suite of contracts. There are 5 main contract forms and an equivalent short form of each. They all have the same principles and objectives behind them and are all drafted in a similar way. I think on the slides you can see that, I'm looking at the screen, I see there's other screens there. You can use them throughout the supply chain for engaging professional services. You can use them for engaging a contractor to do works, construction works or any type of works. You can engage consultants in terms of providing services. You can also use them as a facilities maintenance contract or similar in terms of engaging a contractor or supplier over a period of time providing a service. Great deal of flexibility in the contracts in terms of what it is you are procuring, how you procure it, and the balance of risk between the parties. The contract's been endorsed by a number of organisations, including the Construction Clients Board, Crown Commercial Services. It's recommended by those bodies for use by all public sector procurers in the UK. And I'll come on to some examples of where it's used in the public sector in the UK in a minute. This slide provides a sort of overview of all the different types of contract that are available, and in terms of whatever it is you're procuring, if you like, in the context of the project life cycle. So at the top of the slide, or I say at the bottom of the slide, you've got the stages of a project between business case, design, construction, operation. And then at the top of the slide, you've got the first contracts, the supply contract, and whether it's high or low complexity from a risk point of view. You've got the short form and the long form. In terms of project-related contracts, as opposed to supply, you've got a variety of choices between works and service contracts. And again, there's split between long forms and short forms. The long form contract geared for use where whatever it is you're procuring, there's a higher degree of risk, more complex works or services that you're procuring. So that's where you use long form contracts, which are indicated by the ECC, ECS, TSC, Professional Services Contract, or PSC. Okay, so there are 4 contracts there for works or services. At the low complexity end, i.e. where the services or works are simple, of a simple nature, not particularly risky. You don't need complex risk allocation mechanisms. You can use the short form contracts, and hopefully you can see that they mirror the long form contracts. So for each of the 4 long form contracts, there are the equivalent short form contracts, okay, for engaging, as I say, works or services. And then at the bottom, there are 2 other contracts. There's a framework contract and then there's adjudicator's contract. Okay. The contract's been drafted specifically with the intention of using it across a variety of sectors. So it's not just geared towards, for example, civil engineering works. They're geared, or they've been drafted so that they can be used, whether it's civils or infrastructure works, in the building sector, or in engineering, process engineering. And whether that's for work services or the supply of goods. They're also geared so that you can use them at whatever project stages you're at. So whether you're at design stage, so for engaging a consultant to do design work, or whether you're at the construction stage for engaging a contractor to do construction works. One of the key principles behind the contract is that it stimulates a best project management approach or good management. So it's all about having processes in the contract that provide your project controls in a clear, concise way. Okay. Hopefully you appreciate that unless you've got good project controls, things can run away from you. The contract's been drafted in a style to minimise disputes in terms of anything in terms of lack of clarity or subjective issues. The contracts are drafted to minimise the instances of when they occur. There's a great deal of flexibility in the use of an NEC contract. And if you think about the main works contract, it is designed to be able to be used in a variety of circumstances. So I've already mentioned in terms of sectors between infrastructure, building sector, process engineering. Also, it can cater for a variety of procurement routes in terms of, for example, design responsibility and how that is allocated between the parties in terms of, for example, the employer and contractor. And it's completely flexible in terms of design responsibility, so you can draft the contract where the employer is fully responsible for design, or at the other end of the spectrum, where the contractor is fully responsible for design or anything in between. And you use the same contract, the same processes, irrespective of the allocation of design responsibility. Okay. There's flexibility in the pricing mechanisms. So this is one of the key aspects of the contract in terms of the last but one bullet in terms of risk allocation. So depending upon which pricing mechanism you adopt, that influences how the financial risks are apportioned between the parties. Okay. And as an example, you can have, for example, a lump sum type contract, whether that's with a contractor or a consultant. Or at the other end of the spectrum, you can have a full cost reimbursable contract. Okay. And you've got options in between, including a target cost reimbursable contract. And you can use those different pricing mechanisms, whether it's a consultant or a contractor that you're engaging. Okay. And common across all those different pricing options, you still have the same project control mechanisms within the contract in terms of, for example, change management and the management of time. Okay. This slide shows how the contract is built up in terms of the different parts of the contract. So for each contract that I mentioned earlier, whether it's works or services or supply, there are a common set of core clauses, which is the bit at the bottom. Depending upon which main contract you're using, there is a choice of the main option, which is the payment mechanism. So if you're using the works contract, you've got 6 choices in terms of the payment mechanism, A through F. If you're using the consultant contract, you've got 4 choices in terms of payment options. You choose one main option, which supplements the core clauses in terms of how the payment mechanism works and how the financial risk is allocated between the parties. You then choose one of the dispute resolution options, and this relates back to things like adjudication process, Housing Grants Regeneration Act. So typically in the UK, you would use W2, overseas you would use W1. And then there are a range of secondary option clauses, as you can see there, X clauses and Y clauses and Z clauses. Okay. And each of the X clauses deals with a particular issue. For example, retention or delay damages, changes in law and so on and so forth. There's a whole variety of things that you can deal with through the secondary option clauses. If there are any very project-specific issues that need to be dealt with, then the additional conditions, the Z clauses, are available to write in any specific contract requirements that may suit whatever it is you're procuring. Okay. One of the principles behind the contract, in terms of when it was first drafted, one of the objectives of the contract, if you like, is this piece around clarity and simplicity. And the contract was drafted using plain language in the present tense, and minimizing the use of subjective judgments, because they can lead to disagreements between the parties and hence disputes. The contract's written in plain language so that you don't have to be a lawyer to read it, with all due respect to any lawyers. And the ordinary people or you know, project participants can use the contract as a project management tool, and that's the intention. The contract is there, it tells you what the processes are in the contract clauses, and it's intended that you actively use the contract and follow the processes, unlike perhaps other contracts where sometimes they get signed and then left in the drawer. Okay. There are flow charts that they're not part of the contract, and the guidance notes, they're not part of the contract, but they are available for users to help them understand how the contract works and how the different processes work, and to give you guidance in how you operate the contract. I think I covered the first point already. The contract sets out the duties of the different parties clearly, and again, this is part of the issue of avoiding disagreements and achieving clarity in what each party to the contract should be doing in terms of managing whatever it is you're procuring. Okay. There is also an early warning process in the contract, which is all about risk management, and it's a contractual obligation on both parties in the contract to early warn of any matters that are likely to cause a problem, whether it's a delay in terms of completing the works or services, or an increase in cost, or a quality issue that impacts upon the use of whatever it is being procured, whether it's works or a service. Okay. And the early warning process is a key process, key principle behind all the NEC contracts. So it's about encouraging the parties to work together to mitigate project risk for the benefit of the project. Okay. And it's one of the sort of cornerstones of this contract or the suite of contracts in terms of how to get the best out of this contract. If you think about it, you know, in terms of most aspects of procurement, everybody naturally, as a process of project controls, will go through an early warning process. It might not be called an early warning process, but they do it anyway in terms of managing risk. The NEC contract, all it's doing is formalising that process and providing a mechanism by which the parties work together to minimise risk. Compensation events, that's NEC language for change management or a variation. And similar to other aspects of the contract and early warnings, there is a clear step-by-step process that you go through in order to evaluate a compensation event and agree the effect of the change from a time and cost point of view. Okay, and once it's agreed, you close it down and you move on to the next issue with the project or service that is being delivered. And it provides, the process, if used properly, provides a mechanism by which you can clearly control time and cost on your projects. And as I say, used properly, you can have a great deal, as a client side, you can have a great deal of control over time and cost of whatever it is you're procuring from a work, service, supply point of view. I think I've touched on these aspects already, so I'm not going to dwell too much on these slides, but in summary with this one, NEC combines the use of the main options in terms of risk allocation with management procedures embedded in the contract to control time, cost, risk and quality, with contractual obligations and rights and liabilities, and they're all combined together in terms of how the contract works. The next few slides just give some examples of where the contract's been used, predominantly in the UK, but it has been used elsewhere. So in the building sector, the NHS use the contract for all their procurement under their programme P21+. Heathrow, BAA, as they used to be called, I think, have used it extensively over the years, including Terminal 5. Olympics, 2012 Olympics, all the projects there, all the construction works and the infrastructure were delivered using NEC. They used the whole range of NEC contracts through the Olympics. There was something like 130 plus NEC contracts or packages of work that were procured. And there's some other examples there in terms of predominantly public sector, but there are, as you can see, some private clients there in terms of the likes of GSK and social housing clients. And then you've got other clients there who have used NEC extensively, including the likes of the University of Cambridge, so in the HE sector, and then a variety of other clients, all using NEC in the building sector. This just provides an example of one of the projects, I think, one of the clients, P21 Plus. Something like £4 billion worth of work have been procured through NEC. I think predominantly they use the ECC, the works contract, to date. Infrastructure. So there's a number of clients there who use NEC contracts from utility companies in the water sector and national grid, power sector in terms of the nuclear industry and British Energy, oil sector. Then you've got transport. So in the transport sector, the Highways Agency, they always use NEC across all their major infrastructure projects, and Transport for London. Crossrail. So the current Crossrail project, I think it's circa £15 billion worth of work. It's the largest programme of work that's been procured through the NEC so far. So there's a whole variety of contracts being let using the NEC suite. So here's just some brief details on it there. I mentioned that the NEC suite of contracts includes a term service contract, which can be used for FM type work. And here's some examples of clients using that type of contract, procuring facilities maintenance or facilities management type services. This particular example is from Hong Kong. The government in Hong Kong, similar to the UK government, are recommending that the public sector use NEC. This particular contract is to do with maintaining slopes. If anybody's ever been to Hong Kong there, it's a quite hilly place. And there's a lot of slopes to maintain that are near to roads and infrastructure. And they've got a number of contracts there where they're using the term service contract for maintaining these slopes. Professional services contract. So this is for engaging a consultant, typically, to provide a service, whether it's a design service or project management service or cost management service. And you can see there's a whole range of clients who have used the PSC across a range of works. So you've got school sector, you've got Crossrail, you've got highway sector with the Hammersmith flyover, you've got infrastructure, you've got building sector in Abu Dhabi, nuclear industry and so forth. That gives you some details of the Hammersmith flyover project. And then the supply contract, as I say, I mentioned you've got in the suite of contracts, you've got a works contract, you've got a term service contract, you've got a professional services contract, and you've got a supply contract. So this contract is geared towards procuring large-scale goods. And here's some examples of where it's been used overseas in New Zealand and South Africa, but also in the UK in the nuclear industry. And here's one particular example of procuring some harbour cranes in Guernsey. The NEC, who published the contract, also provide related services, whether it be training or consultancy services, to support the implementation of the contract, along with organising events, workshops and training and seminars. And those who may know, there's quite an active user group which clients, consultants, contractors can join, where you can get useful information and guidance and support in terms of the implementation of the contract. Right, that's about it. Any questions?
Hi, Nathan Target from Plan. I'm just intrigued about the Z clause at the end, where I'm finding, or I've noticed, and it's been passed on to me as well, if others notice in planning, is that Z clauses are used as a way of kind of entrapping people, because they're not really, you know, we talk about plain English, everything's fine, and then suddenly the lawyers have got hold, sorry for any lawyers in the room, have got hold of and actually putting the risk onto the contractor or the supplier by adding stuff into the Z clauses. And yes. I mean, obviously, everybody's responsible for themselves to read the Z clause, and they should go straight there first anyway, because pretty much everything is standard. But it's, have you noticed that that's where people are going with the putting risk over?
I think, well, I've just spent most of this morning doing a workshop on that very topic.
Sorry, I missed that.
No, sorry. But no, it is an issue. The option Z is intended to be additional conditions of contract to give people the flexibility to add in additional obligations specific to whatever it is they're procuring. It wasn't the intention of it to be used to amend the existing clauses. And of course that happens. And there are, you know, a lot of problems that flow from that in terms of them not being drafted in a style consistent with the contract, creating an unfair contract, and of course that depends on your point of view in terms of client or supplier, but nevertheless, changing the dynamics of the contract, and sort of generally detracting from the objectives in terms of what this contract is about, which ultimately is about controlling in an appropriate way whatever it is you're procuring from a time, cost, quality point of view. So there are a lot of challenges there. I think part of it is about going through an appropriate process of drafting the contract. You know, if you, with all due respect to lawyers, you know, often they're just asked to have a look at the contract and draft a set of amendments without seeing the rest of the contract. So they're having to deal with things without the benefit of seeing what the other documents within the contract have said or not said. There is guidance out there, you know, and the NEC are providing guidance and are continually developing that guidance in terms of how to improve the drafting of contracts, NEC contracts, including, you know, dealing with Z clauses. But it can be a challenge.
Hi, my question just generally is, I know there's certain clauses where you're sort of time barred on certain things, or there's time limits. Is there any more thoughts on maybe future revisions where you'd be introducing more of those things? I'm thinking mainly around like program acceptance. Sometimes those things kind of drag on forever, and whereas if there was some mechanism to force a resolution, just wonder your thoughts.
I think that's likely. I would agree, specifically program acceptance. There's no deemed acceptance in the contract. There are, deemed acceptances through the compensation event process that can help the parties, close it out if people aren't doing what they're supposed to do. And I think there's a place for us, the equivalent provision with regard to accepting the programme, because you're quite right. You can get into projects or situations where you don't get an accepted programme and it just goes on. And I think that's to the detriment of everybody on that project.
You spoke about the main payment options affecting the way that risk was managed within.
Sorry, Sally.
You said that the main payment options determine the way that risk was managed within NEC. Can you expand on that, how that kind of looks, how that manifests itself?
Okay, yeah. So in terms of the main options, the risk that it is allocating is entirely to do with the financial risk, or in terms of payment, estimating risk. So for example, main option A is a lump sum contract. So under that contract, the contractor carries a larger risk than otherwise would be the case. He prices the works, and if he gets that price wrong, he carries the risk of any errors in his pricing, because all he will get paid, notwithstanding compensation events, all he'll get paid is the cost of the works that he's priced. Okay. The sort of to compare at the other end of the spectrum, the main option E contract is a cost reimbursable contract. So you don't have a contract sum, because the contractor gets paid whatever costs are incurred in delivering the service or works. There is a set of rules in that contract about disallowing costs and what are allowable costs and so forth, as you can imagine. In principle, that's no different to any other cost reimbursable contract. But notwithstanding that set of rules, effectively you pay him whatever costs are incurred. So as you can see, between those two contracts, you've got sort of two ends of the spectrum there in terms of the allocation of financial or the estimating risk, if you like. There are other main options, if you like, sit in between those two ends of the spectrum. So options C and D are a cost reimbursable contract with a target associated with it. And so you pay the contractor or consultant the costs incurred within the set of rules. If those costs exceed the target, and the target is adjusted for change, if the costs exceed the target, then there's a pay and gain share mechanism. And of course, if the actual costs come in under the target, you're in a gain situation. So there's an incentive there for the supplier to bring the costs in lower. And then there's a disincentive in terms of if the costs go above the target, where he starts suffering pain. Okay, so there's a whole variety of options. And how, for example, under C, how the pay and gain works is entirely flexible. So there's flexibility in terms of how you set the pay and gain share and how much pain is suffered and when it's suffered and so forth. So there's a great deal of flexibility in terms of apportioning the financial risk. Okay, hopefully that answers your question.